to do what they are able to have, and a lot of money, kind of wealth and everything, but he has to be very careful on how he does that, because he has to go out and actually do things to make that money. They had money just from being born into their family. So with that, George Washington is very careful on how he puts his image out to the world. And these documents were one of that form. Now, the only reason that George Washington decides to write these documents is because his biographer was a very close friend of his. He says, George, I think as you're becoming the President of the United States, that the American people would like to know about your time before the American Revolution, when you are a British officer, and learn about all of your successes, but also all of the failures that you went through. George was not too happy about maybe putting that out, but he does eventually agree because the biographer is a close friend. He tells him, okay, listen, I'm going to write this for you on one condition. These documents have to be burned. I want them destroyed after you write my biography. Says, okay, so then George goes and he writes these documents. Now they're very interesting to look at in terms of something we wouldn't expect the President of the United States to be putting out there. Number one, if you look at the documents as a whole, they look very kind of helter-skelter, just haphazard. He writes things down, and then there's multiple places he just kind of like scratches it out. He even has a couple places where he gets way too much ink on his quill, makes a big old blot right on the paper. Actually, too, these blots here, kind of like how you can see it's starting to deteriorate on the paper, that is because of what the ink they're using at the time. It's called iron gall ink, has a lot of iron in it. So when George got too much ink on his quill, it created a nice little splotch there. And then as that paper goes through time, what's going to happen is the air is going to interact with the iron in his ink. It's going to create like a little reaction. It's actually burning a hole through the paper. So George is not really helping our documents stay in pristine condition because of that. He's also going to take portions and actually write on the side of the documents and create, they're called footnotes too. So that's where you'll put like a little, either a number or like a symbol, and then you go to another portion of the page and you can kind of write it out a bit more, so you don't have to like cram it all in. But these are very different documents than what we would expect the President of the United States to write. They're not very neat, they're not tidy, they're just kind of like all thrown together, very quick aspects. And that is because George Washington did not want this to get out into the world. So he gave this to his biographer, and sadly, his biography falls through. It never gets published. These documents are never really turned into anything official. And instead of destroying them, as his biographer should have done, kept these documents. And it's a very good thing that he kept them, because they give us a lot of really cool information about George Washington, especially about his time in the French and Indian War. One of those occasions that he talks about comes from this page right here. And this is where he's talking about the Forbes campaign. So that's where we come into play here with Fort Ligonier. We're part of the Forbes campaign, which is the third attempt by the British Army to try and take Fort Duquesne, which is in modern-day Pittsburgh. Really, the British are trying to push the French all out of this area. So whenever George Washington arrives here at Fort Ligonier, he comes at the end of October of 1758. Now this is only about 2 weeks after we were attacked by the French. The French come with a small band of men to try and scare the British out of this location because they're starting to put a fort. Now this is the most permanent spot we have gotten to Fort Duquesne, so the French don't like that. And the French aren't able to really push us out. All they do is scare off our horses and our cattle. But when George Washington comes here, you have to imagine the anxieties, how scared his soldiers are probably, because they're not sure if the French are ever going to come back. The weather is not the greatest. It's really cold, not as cold as it is today, but it's also going to be really rainy, and the weather is just not the best. And the soldiers, they're constantly living outside in this. So when he arrives, he kind of has to work with the other officers to determine, what are we going to do? Are we going to stay here at Fort Ligonier for the winter, or are we going to try to keep going to get Fort Duquesne and put a big, large-scale attack and have a big battle down there? And what our General Forbes, is going to decide is he says, we're going to stay here. We're going to stay at Fort Ligonier. We're going to regroup, and we'll think about what we're going to do to go try and take Fort Duquesne in the spring. However, we're going to wake up on the morning of November 12th of 1758. We're going to have a very, very scary experience for George Washington happen here. So this painting is actually taking portions of this document, this page right here, of what George Washington was writing about, what's going to happen, what we call the Friendly Fire Incident. And it's kind of giving us a nice visual to look at it. So when we wake up in the morning of November 12th, 1758, there are rumors that the French have come back. So the soldiers want to stop this. General Forbes orders one of the Virginian regiments under the command of George Mercer to leave Fort Ligonier and go get the French and kind of scare them out of here. So they're going to leave the fort, and they'll disappear kind of right across where modern-day Route 30 is, and the forest behind us, and they disappear over that ridgeline. And then eventually we're going to start to hear gunfires off in the distance, suggesting that maybe George Mercer and these Virginians ended up finding the French, and they started to battle, they attacked them. But the thing is, we're going to hear that for hours and hours and hours, and we're not going to hear anything from George Mercer. He's not sending soldiers back telling us what's happening. We're getting really scared that maybe the French sent a large band of men and we have a big battle that's occurring. So with that, George Washington is actually going to volunteer his Virginian regiment and take any soldiers that want to volunteer themselves to go with him. He's going to leave the fort, and he's going to go out to try and help George Mercer. Now, George Washington was expecting to come out, and if we have George Mercer's men here and the French here, Washington is hoping to come out from behind George Mercer's men, come around the French, and kind of create like a little sandwich to cut the French off. So then that way we can make sure that the British will be okay. But there's going to be a couple things that make this very difficult for George Washington. Number one is if you look at all of these outfits here, we also have a nice example of that in the back of the room, the mannequin back there. That is what all of the Virginian regiments that were here at Fort Ligonier were wearing. We call that native or Indian dress.
I know.
You know? Yeah.
Do you know? This is what they're called.
Yes, yeah. And they would do that call to kind of scare the British soldiers.
And also to like call other people like that.
Yes. Exactly. So the reason that our British soldiers are wearing that is because the Native Americans were actually trained to pick off like the regimental coats. Yep, you're great. So if we're wearing the bright red coats, we're going to stand out like a sore thumb, right?
Yeah.
So it's easy to pick us off. Yes, but you see, so this is what we call a Virginian regimental coat. So this is like what George Washington would have worn. It's blue on the outside and then has the red on the inside. Well, guess what? Native Americans were also trained to look for that as they're walking through the forest, pick those off. There's also the Pennsylvania regiment. They had a similar looking coat to that, but instead of the blue portion, it would have been green, and then they still had the red portions there. All of that still stands out like a sore thumb. The other thing too is to make all of my soldiers wear a nice cool uniform like that costs money. Costs a lot of money, especially when you think about we have 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers here at Fort Ligonier. And if you have to spend money to get them all coats to look exactly the same, well, that money's going to add up really fast. And when it comes to making my soldiers look all nice and pretty or feeding my soldiers, I'm going to probably want to feed my soldiers. It's more important to buy rations than it is to buy these coats. But by wearing this dress for my soldier, he's going to probably already own the shirt. That's something that everyone would have had. So he already owns half of that. And then what's on their legs, we call those leggings, and it's just basically wool ties that go up your legs. We can get that really cheap, and my soldier can make it himself. We now can blend into the woods. If a Native American sees us, it's going to be harder for them to determine, are we friend, are we foe? So it might be able that I can get out of that situation before I get attacked. And also too, I can blend in. Plus, you can see on a couple of them here, they have kind of blankets around their shoulders. I can put a blanket on and sew it in a certain way that it's like a jacket, and I can stay warm in cold weather. When it gets really hot out, I can get rid of my blanket, and now all of this is linen, so whenever the breeze comes by on a big hot day, it'll pull me off. I can actually feel it. So this is really, really beneficial for the British Army to use something like this rather than the red coats that we think of. But the problem is, George Mercer's men are wearing that clothing. George Washington's men are wearing that clothing. The French soldiers are wearing that too. And then the Native Americans with the French are wearing that. What do you think could happen? Something like that.
A big battle.
A big battle. But do you think you'd be able to tell who's your friend and who's your enemy when that happens?
Yes.
You're right on. No, you cannot. And that's what's going to happen to George Washington. As him and his soldiers are coming through all of the woods trying to help George Mercer and his men, they're going to come to a big clearing. Now, the other thing, too, is you'll notice we are all wearing the same outfit, but it's getting dark. And it is really, really rainy on that day. So that means it's foggy. It's really hard to see. And when we come to a clearing, there are soldiers across from us, and we think we have got the French. Here it is. We're going to start firing upon them. They start firing upon us, and we're going to fire back and forth and back and forth. And George Washington is going to write in this document here when he describes this. He was so confident it was the French, but then something just felt strange. It happened very fast, and there wasn't a lot of time to really think things through. So he's going to kind of duck behind a tree, and he's going to stop and he's going to listen. And as he listens, he can hear that the soldiers across from him, they're yelling out commands in English. They're yelling English commands. He's like, oh, that's weird. The French don't know English. We don't know French. Why would the French be yelling out English commands? Only George Mercer and his men know English commands. Then it hits him. That's George Mercer and his men. We are firing upon our own British soldiers. So he's going to jump up and he's going to start yelling to his soldiers, stop, stop firing. These are our men. But between the sounds of our muskets going off, it's really hard to hear. These guys are so scared that they also just are kind of acting without really thinking. They don't hear him yelling to stop. And George Washington realizes, I have to actually take action. So he's going to run out in front of his soldiers, take his sword, and tip their muskets up. Now this is extremely dangerous because as he is doing this, his soldiers are firing live rounds. George Mercer's men have not yet realized that it's George Washington and his Virginia. They're firing live rounds at him. At any point, George Washington could have been wounded or potentially even killed, which would have completely changed history as we know it. Now, thankfully, George Washington is successful in stopping the fire. As he runs out and tips the muskets up, his soldiers stop firing, and then Mercer's men realizes it's George Washington, we need to stop. Now, with this, though, we do have a couple casualties that come out of it. We have about 30 to 40 casualties that come out of this affair. A lot of those are actually just listed as missing in action, so it's not really uncommon in this time period for us to go into the woods and lose about 20 to 30 men if they just get lost in the woods. That's where a large portion of the casualty list is. But as they are coming back to Fort Ligonier to have to tell General Forbes what just happened, they find 3 French soldiers that were in the woods. So the French were out there. George Mercer and his men had found them. They had a small skirmish, and then as the French moved around, they lost George Mercer, and that's whenever George Washington comes into play. When they find these 3 soldiers, they capture them, bring them back here to Fort Ligonier, and they're going to talk with General Forbes. And they're going to tell General Forbes that Fort Duquesne is not doing too good. They have a hard time bringing in new troops. The troops that they have before, they're kind of sick. They're not really feeling the greatest. So if they were to fight, they're not going to do too well. They can't bring in food to feed these troops. And their Native American allies are all going home for the winter. They don't want to be out here in the weather and the elements. They're going to go back with their families. Meaning that if the British wanted to march on Fort Duquesne, they could take it and be successful in that. Well, hearing that this was pretty much the golden opportunity, that what we've been after for so many years during the French and Indian War, General Forbes is going to decide, let's actually move out here and let's go march on Fort Duquesne. And that's where at the end of November, so only a couple weeks after this happens, the British Army arrives at Fort Duquesne and is able to capture it. They clear away the old fort because the French had destroyed Fort Duquesne. Classic case of if I can't have it, neither can you. And they build a new fort on top of it that they're going to name Fort Pitt. That's where we get the name of Pittsburgh today. But with all of that,
we're back up here at Fort Ligonier. It's a very cold day today, so don't mind me. I shiver a bit. These are some mortars and a cannon. 8-inch mortar, cohorn. Artillery gin. And that's how you move it. The smaller cannons right here. Little swivel gun. Forbes himself would have had, I believe that would have been his place right there on the fort. General Forbes. You can see the thatching they did. So imagine trying to take that. Some of the slates. Great position of higher land.